So normally my book reviews are a lot more brief, but for this one I wanted to go into a lot more detail and summarize each of the chapters because I think this topic and its implications are very significant, especially in my own community. And also, this book was a lot more in my wheelhouse in terms of what I've studied formally in biblical studies and theology. And so I really appreciated the work done here, and I'm glad to be able to discuss it. So this book is called The Evolution of Adam, and it's by Pete Enns, who is a Christian Bible scholar. And his audience that he's focusing on are Christians who are wrestling or struggling with how to reconcile their faith and trusting the Bible with the idea of evolution. Now, this is a motivation that I share, and what I've noticed in Christian community is that even though people are hesitant to believe certain things about old Earth and evolution, for the most part, it seems like people are more willing to accept an old universe, maybe even an old Earth, and they can even go so far as to say evolution has happened for other creatures. But when it comes to evolution of humanity, us, people are a lot more hesitant and unwilling to accept what the scientific community says about it. Now, this certainly has to do with our understanding of our own nature and our significance in the world. And so what Pete Enns focuses on is specifically how people find it difficult to reconcile what we know about Adam in the biblical narrative and square that with the ideas of evolution. So he talks about how our understanding of Adam in the biblical text has changed, evolved over time. So the point being, Pete Enns' goal with this book is to help people understand from a theological perspective and a biblical studies perspective how evolution doesn't cause any problems for Christian faith. So to start with chapter 1, Pete Enns talks about this shift in history that happened in the 19th century. So as we all know, there were many scientific advances that happened in the period of the Enlightenment and after. And interestingly, in the 19th century, there were also great leaps that we made in biblical studies. Now, a lot of people might be confused by this because it doesn't seem like there's anything new that we can learn about the Bible. But actually, that's not the case. There were things that we discovered, and this has updated our understanding of the Bible, and as Pete Enns argues, should motivate us to update our understanding of our own theology. Now, some of the sort of advances that we made in the 19th century were the ideas of biblical criticism and archaeology. And when I say biblical criticism, some people might think that sounds like criticizing the Bible, but that's not the case. It needs to be thought of more in terms of critical thinking. So what critical scholars do is they think critically about the Bible. And so even Christian scholars are critical scholars. One of the important topics in the 19th century was the idea of who wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Traditionally, this was thought to be Moses, but there are indications within the text and outside of the text that suggest that Moses couldn't have written any of the Pentateuch. And so this was a problem that was being worked on in this time period, and ultimately, there are different ideas that came out of it that helped biblical scholars understand the history of the text better. And so this shift in the 19th century was really more from thinking primarily theologically to thinking about the history of the text. Who wrote it? When was it written? Now, just to take note, it's important to mention that this idea of critical studies of the Bible has always existed. The idea of people reading the text, noticing things that don't seem to make sense, and trying to make sense of them in certain ways, that's what theology has been for many centuries. In the 19th century, we're not doing anything new by looking at these seeming problems and trying to make sense out of them. It was just a shift from, we're not just reading the text and try to build theological ideas out of it. We're also now trying to delve underneath, look at the history, and understand its origin. And so this is why archaeology was also an extremely important factor in our leap forward in understanding the Bible in the 19th century. And there's a lot about this that's significant, which Pete Enns talks about in later chapters. So in chapter 2, Pete Enns specifically focuses on this issue of who wrote the Pentateuch. Now, there's a lot of detail in terms of how we know that Moses couldn't have written it, but the basic general consensus of biblical scholars is that The Pentateuch, as we have it in our modern form, was a culmination of collecting and designing it over time. And so scribes and the authors of the Bible put it together at a certain point. And the consensus amongst biblical scholars is that this culmination was completed after the Babylonian exile of the Hebrew people. It might not be new to many people to see that there are lots of indications throughout the Pentateuch of the story of the Israelites. And you can see sort of a biblical theology of how they understand themselves in their own world in relation to God, in relation to other nations around them. Even just from this vantage point, what we can tell is that Genesis 1 and 2 at the very least, and the creation stories, they're not meant to be taken literally. They are a literary depiction of the place of the Hebrew people in their world and their understanding of their relationship with God and the people around them. And so one way of summarizing this might be, you don't have to know anything about science at all to know that Genesis 1 and 2 are not meant to be taken literally. They are a literary depiction of the theological views of the people of God. Now in chapter 3, Enns discusses something that's really, really important for a lot of people to understand. Now in the 19th century, this archaeology that we were doing to help us understand the Bible more, now in this time frame, we discovered other ancient Near Eastern creation and flood stories. And these stories are very, very similar to the ones that we see in the Bible. They come from contemporary cultures and even earlier times than the biblical accounts were written. And so, what we've seen from stories like Enuma Elish and Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh is that there's a lot of language and imagery and ideas that are borrowed in the biblical text. So they're, in part, borrowing from these earlier creation stories in their contemporary cultures. Now, there are significant differences as well, but what we notice here is that the function of these stories in the Bible are meant to be something called polemic, which is sort of a way of taking the idea of the other and sort of tearing it down or contradicting it in certain ways. But the point is that the Bible is actually in dialogue with these other ancient Near Eastern creation stories. Now, this is significant because what it shows us is the Bible is not meant to be a scientific or historical text. It's written, again, as a theological account. And what it's doing is the authors are looking at the contemporary stories of their time and they're saying, no, that's not how it happened. That's not the way God is. This is the way God is. This is how we understand our relationship with God. So it's a theological account. It's not a scientific or historical account that's meant to be taken literally. And so the major point that Enns makes here is that a faithful commitment to the Bible as God's word, as understood as God's word, doesn't require that we take the Bible literally. And we don't need to take it as a scientific or historical text. We need to understand it through the lens of the authors and through their own context, which says that they are talking about theological ideas, not scientific ones. Now, chapter 4, this one gets a lot more into the weeds of symbolism within the Pentateuch. And the point here basically is to just show what the authors are doing. And again, it has nothing to do with science and very little to do with history. It has a lot more to do with how they understand their place in the world and their relationship with God. And so it's really, really important to understand this symbolism when interpreting the Bible. And this is something that's actually really hard to do. You need to do a lot of deep work in order to interpret these symbols appropriately in our time. It's a lot harder to do that for us because we're so far removed from the original authors. But we are able to identify these symbols and these intended meanings in certain ways. And so that's what Enns is talking about here. So once again, the point is there's a lot that it requires for us to understand and interpret the Bible, and it needs to be interpreted with the context of the biblical authors, which are unfortunately somewhat unavailable to a lot of us. So in chapter 5, he shifts a little bit from just the creation stories and the ancient Hebrew context towards a little bit more early Christian period, and specifically the Apostle Paul. So the other big issue that Christians have with the idea of Adam and evolution is the fact that it seems like Paul makes certain statements about Adam that indicate that he believes that this is a literal historical thing that happened, that Adam actually existed as the first human and everybody has come from him. And so evolution doesn't seem to jive with Paul's understanding of Adam. And so this is something that Pete Enns wants to address in the second part of the book. So in chapter 5, what he does is he sets up a framework for how we should be understanding Paul's theology and specifically his view of Adam. Now, overall, Paul's theology comes from a robust understanding of Hebrew scripture and literature. Now, that doesn't just mean the Old Testament. Paul would have been very, very familiar with a lot of extra biblical texts that are not a part of the Bible today, but were an integral part of the Jewish literature community. Paul would also have been familiar with a lot of other ideas in Greek philosophy and so forth. But the point is that Paul was essentially a scholar in his day, and he's drawing from a lot more than we might realize he's drawing from. But even his understanding and use of the Old Testament is a lot more thorough and deep than we realize just by reading through the New Testament. It requires loads and loads of work just to understand how Paul is using the Old Testament in his own theology. Now, in chapter 6, what Enns discusses is how Paul uses all of that stuff. And it's different than we might actually think today. So it might be surprising for a lot of people to know that Paul actually sort of, in some sense, misuses the biblical text and misquotes it in certain ways. Now, it's not that he's making any sort of mistake here. Paul is intentionally redefining and reimagining a lot of what's going on in the biblical text. So he takes ideas and quotes from the Old Testament and other extra biblical literature, and he applies it in a different context, ones in which they don't really seem to make a whole lot of sense. But this is the point, is that Paul is doing creative theological thinking, and he's building a new theology. There wasn't one universal idea for the things that he talks about in the New Testament. There were varying ideas, and he has his own. And what he does is he takes the ideas that he is aware of in other literature, and he applies it to his context in ways that he believes they are valid. So a major point here that Enns is making is that this sort of reimagining and reinterpreting of the biblical texts, this is something that has always happened. It's happened even since Paul's time, and certainly before. It was a part of the Jewish community to do this, and Paul doesn't really deviate from that. He does it as well. And so we have to keep in mind that with whatever Paul says, he can't be read flatly. We have to understand what he's thinking and what he's saying in terms of this entire robust structure of how he utilizes the ideas of his texts in his setting. Now, in chapter 7, Enns addresses this passage in Romans 5 that is the one that kind of makes people hesitant, specifically Christians, hesitant to accept this idea of evolution on the grounds that Paul seems to think Adam is a historical figure. Now, to say this up front, it is likely true that Paul believed that Adam was the literal, historical first human from which we all came. Now, the thing is, even though most biblical scholars and scientists would say that this is not true, it doesn't actually change Paul's theology, because there's still this issue of sin and death and what Paul knew or believed to be the resurrection. And in Romans, it's specifically important to identify that the context in which Paul uses this term all, as in all men or all people, it's not to say every single person on the planet. What it means is all groups of people. Because specifically in Romans, Paul is talking about Jews and Gentiles, and he's talking about the unification of them under Christ. And so when Paul says all people, he's referring to the fact that Gentiles can be included in the family of God, and that all people can be unified under this. And so here we can see that the theology really doesn't change. Regardless of Paul's view of the historical Adam, it doesn't really change what Paul is saying about this idea of unification under Christ. Now, you might ask, well, why would we accept Paul's view theologically but not historically? Well, it might be helpful to think about the fact that Paul wasn't able, any more than we are, to actually see what happened in the earliest history of time. However, he did believe what he believed about Christ because of his own personal experiences. So there's a major difference there in terms of what was available to him about the history of time versus what was available to him about his understanding of Christ. And so once again, kind of the major point here is that it is not necessary to see Paul's understanding of Adam historically as literal and true in order for his theological point to be true. Now, in chapter 8, Enns does a wonderful thing and summarizes with 9 points. And so these 9 points are: 1, literalism is not an option. And so basically, when we talk about the scientific evidence available to us, we have to be willing to take that in and develop and change our own theology based on that evidence. It's not helpful to look at the world around us and ignore the things that we're seeing. We have to be able to implement those things into our worldview. Now, I'll talk elsewhere about the importance of scientific evidence and all of it that's available to us and why we should not just take that into account, but accept the ideas of evolution and old Earth. But for now, Enns just encourages us to be aware of it and allow it to make an impact on our views and perspective. Point number 2 is that the Bible and science are speaking on different grounds. The Bible is not speaking as a science or historical text. The Bible is speaking in a theological realm. The authors of the Bible that compiled the Pentateuch and the rest of the Old Testament, they were describing their own story in the world, and this sort of primordial history and this idea of Adam ultimately is a representative of the Hebrew people themselves. So it's not meant to be a literal scientific historical account of the world. And thus, even if Paul did believe this, we need not maintain that in order to glean the truth from Paul's theology in Romans. Point number 3 is that Genesis must be understood in the context of ancient Near Eastern creation myths. Now, Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, these are a few amongst various stories that have parallels in the Bible, and we can see how the Bible is in dialogue with them. And so we have to understand it in these literary terms, and we can't just take our own modern understanding of a scientific and historical text and impose that on the Bible. That would be imposing a meaning into the minds of the authors, ones that they did not intend. And this makes us kind of the author of their story. Point number 4 is that the consensus amongst biblical scholars is that there are 2 creation stories, the creation story in Genesis 1 and the creation story in Genesis 2. These are separate and they can't be harmonized. And there are a variety of ways that we can see this. But the important factor here is that these stories were placed together and designed in the Torah to represent the primordial history of the Hebrew people, and they represent the origins of the people themselves, not of humans as we exist biologically in this world, but of the Hebrew people as they exist in their own context theologically. Point number 5 is that the Adam story in Genesis really reflects wisdom literature like Proverbs, and what this means is it's a lot more parabolic than we might initially think. So what that means is it's telling a truth about how we exist in the world. It's not telling a historical account, but it's explaining how we should orient ourselves toward God and how we are oriented in the world as human beings. That is to say, how we can live wisely as members of the human race. Point number 6 is that Paul expresses his understanding of salvation in terms of available idioms that he had in his culture and in his time. And so this, in the context of Romans, is when he's talking about Jews and Gentiles and the unification of them under Christ. And we don't need to exempt Paul when we think about the fact that no human is infallible, even one that is supposedly speaking on behalf of God. Point number 7 is that a true understanding of inspiration is that God speaks through people in their own time, in their own context, and this means it's going to be somewhat messy. It's not going to be perfect, and even if it were, it wouldn't be mediated in a perfect way. And so Enns says we should think of inspiration in an incarnational sense. That is to say, the Word takes on the flesh of humanity in the sense that it is just as messy as anything else in the world. God does condescend to the understanding of the authors and their own perspectives about the world. And it's not infallible, but it needs to be interpreted in such a way that takes into account everything about their own worldview. Point number 8 is that the core conflict here really isn't scientific and theological. It's actually more about group identity and fear. The reason that people are unwilling or hesitant to accept the ideas of evolution and shift our worldview to implement the new information that becomes available to us is because they're afraid that what it meant for them before is going to go away or be taken from them. That is, it challenges their previous understanding, and that makes people uncomfortable. However, as we see with Paul and the entire history of the Christian tradition, it's always been part of it to take in new information and change our worldview, adapt and modify based on what it is that's being revealed to us in the world. And point 9 here that Enns says is that the proper understanding of and way of reconciling faith and evolution is not simply compressing science into the worldview that we already hold and trying to manipulate it and make it fit in somehow. Rather, it requires synthesis. We have this information here, and we have this understanding theologically, and there are certain ways that they may need to fit together simply by modification. The reality is that evolution informs our understanding of the origins of sin and death. And like Galileo with the heliocentric theory, we need to be willing to update our understanding of our own theology. We need to be able to update our interpretation of the Bible such that it actually makes sense with the world that we are in, the world that God supposedly creates. The evidence that's available to us is a part of that. It shouldn't be rejected on the grounds of something that we once held true. And one of the final points that Enns makes here is the idea that we shouldn't conflate what we think we know about God with God's actual nature. That makes us fully capable, supposedly, of understanding what God is like. That just demonstrates that we presume to fully understand God. And so we need to be more humble than that. We need to be humble enough to be able to take in this evidence that we see around us and change our views in such a way that it actually fits with the world. So overall, this was a really, really great book. I'd pretty much say 10 out of 10. Check out the video about the actual scientific evidence for evolution and things like this. But for now, that's the theological understanding of how we can understand the evolution of Adam.